Yes, I come from the African Union, and I'm here to address you. So I'm very privileged and happy to be among you today, and I present my thanks to the World Bank for inviting me to be here. Honestly, I have a full kind of speech prepared. Unfortunately, it was made almost redundant by the excellent welcoming notes that preceded me, because I guess he made the case both for transport and for Africa. So I'm not sure whether I'm still wanted on this podium, but I'll try my best maybe to add a little bit or to beef a little bit on the things my predecessor just mentioned. Of course, you all are familiar with the Africa Rising slogan. In Africa, we don't say that. We say Africa has risen. So why we are saying this? Because we're doing great. Lots of challenges, enormous challenges. And yet, and despite all these challenges, we're moving forward and very fast. And it's not just about the digital, as often is being said, but also on transport and on energy and on trade and on so many other fronts. If you've been traveling lately in Africa, Mr. Mortar here just said that he was in Senegal. I was in Dakar recently, and I go to Dakar, or have been going to Dakar before. As soon as you land, it's not the airport we used to have previously in Dakar. It's not the roads that we used to have in Dakar. It's beautiful. Now what I'm seeing in Dakar is beautiful. And that's the story almost everywhere on the continent. We talked about a continent of 55 countries, and the means of transportation are various, between roads, railways, air transport, maritime. Means of transportation have all kinds of means of transportation, whether it's motorized or non-motorized. We see the development of e-riding. Now we have 50 companies of e-riding across the continent, 21 countries. We're seeing drones in some countries delivering medicine, and we're working on the lifting power. We're seeing railways being developed on the continent, and very fast. Some even are unmanned, some are electrical. So this is all great. Then, is there a challenge? Yes. Yes, there are challenges, and there are always challenges. And if you don't believe in the kind of challenges transport, or how important transport is for an economy, just follow the news. In one major country, one of the top countries, there's a problem on public transportation because of some social and economic pressures. Public transportation is not working. Just see what title there is this week in one of the newspapers. It's talking about how this situation is paralyzing and is almost ruining the economy of that country. I'm talking about one of the first economies in the world, and about public transportation not being working as it should for just several weeks. And it's almost crippling that country. Now, see how would be the case then, or is the case in Africa. The problem or the challenges in Africa, many of these roads are either inefficient, inadequate for use, or non-existent. The airports, some are very good, some needs serious rehabilitation. Maritime needs to be rethought. Same as railways, because many of our railways and maritime means of transportation used to cater for the colonizers. So they go from the mines to the outside world. Does not link the country with itself, does not link our countries among themselves. So either in terms of quality, or even the paths that these transport means are being done, nor in terms of inclusiveness, and it was mentioned earlier, meaning the inclusivity of those who are using this transportation. So the transportation systems on the continent needs to be seriously looked and relooked at. Another major pressure, not even challenge, it's challenge, but it's a pressure. This is a continent that is urbanizing very fast. By the year 2030, 50% or more of our population will be living in cities. When we talk about cities, we have a completely different or almost completely different picture because you need different means of transportation. And to rethink the way, that the city is working and working also with the different centers across the country and also across the continent. Not to mention that currently many of our city dwellers live in poverty and in slums that are very highly populated or densely populated without practically any infrastructure, especially transport infrastructure. So is there a hope? Of course there is always hope, and there is always, that light that leads you and keeps you going forward. We are also very happy that we're seeing on the continent this major developments when it comes to digital, and I did mention the e-riding earlier. Why is it important? Because it's also providing us with a different ways of thinking and rethinking our transportation system, especially for the cities. We are very happy also that the continent is making serious and big progress when it comes to the use of sustainable energy sources in order to make sure that all these means of transportation are working. And we are contributing, and we want to contribute to the efficiency, the energy efficiency, and one of the ways of contributing to the energy efficiency is also minding the ways we use our transportation systems. So nothing, is in nature or in development in life, there's no such thing as sectoral approach, but it has to be a multi-sectoral approach. So that's why I'm also touching on energy and digital, which provide us, as I said, with lots of hope on the continent. However, as I said, it's still challenges, and it needs all hands on deck. And this is why, as I said earlier, I appreciated very much the welcoming remarks, because they set the tone on how important it is of all of us working together, especially with the private sector in that sense. I want to touch upon another dimension on the continent where we talk a lot about transportation as very important. You are aware that the continent last year, our free trade agreement, the African Free Trade Agreement, has come into force. That was in July 2019. Great. Now you want to move goods and people. How are you going to do that without regional or cross-continental infrastructure, and especially transport? So it's not just about the transport within the country, but the transport across the regions and across the continent. And that's where the African Union comes in, because our main mission and our vision is an integrated continent and a prosperous and peaceful continent. And this is where also the pressure from our colleagues in the Trade Department, where they keep working with us or pressuring us for delivering on the infrastructure, regional and cross-continental infrastructure. Just to give you a feel of what it represents, we have on the continent between the cost of transport component in the value of African transport commodities is the highest in the world. It ranges between 30% and 60% of our exports, and this is far more than the 20% that is the average globally. The inefficiencies across borders is costing Africa around $170 billion a year. So that's, of course, hampering and adversely affecting our competitiveness. So when we stretch our hands to work with our partners and with the private sector and with other or bilateral partners, we insist on this aspect of transport because we want to make sure that also our aspirations in a connected continent, but also in terms of making this African Free Trade Area and other initiatives are well on their way into working and serving the continent and serving the population of the continent as it should. Now, what do we do in the, or what have we done as African Union for transportation, regional and cross-continental transportation. Of course, in 2018, we delivered the Open Skies, or the African single market for air transport. And I'm very happy to report that 33 countries out of 55 African countries have now joined this market, representing about 89% of the air transport on the continent, and including the major African companies. That's a major development when it comes to air transport on the continent, and the hope that that all the continent will be connected more efficiently and more effectively, and to reduce the cost, to increase the lines between African countries. Our highway corridors are on their way. 56,000 kilometers have been implemented using smart technologies, which is great. We are now also rolling out our strategy for the connectivity to rural areas, making sure that all these rural areas through which, many of the major highways go through are connected, which is not always the case, even though it sounds logical, but it's not. And we insist on two other elements that we added this year. One, women. Women as not just as riders, but as part of the process or all across the value chain when it comes to transport. So not just that women are users of the transport, but they should be at the policy level, they should be at the conceptual level of every project, they should be consulted on the users. The roads have to cater to their needs and behavior. The roads have to also make sure that the workforce, because roads or transport in general are also good means of generating jobs, and we want to make sure that women are included, as I said, across the value chain when it comes to transportation. Second is climate. Climate change, and it was highlighted in the welcoming note. Climate change in Southern Africa, for the third time in less than 1 year, they have been, again, the victims of serious storms and serious climate problems that are withering, all the efforts when it comes to economic benefits and or infrastructure. I need not to tell you that the continent is the one that suffers most when it comes to climate changes, and the problems now are occurring more severely and more frequently than they need to. That's why we are insisting, and this is something we discussed with the World Bank when we were here in the fall meetings. The resilience aspect has to be, taken very seriously on the continent, and we are doing our share, and more especially when it comes to we have very low emissions, as is 2%, and even with all the continent having access to energy, we'll still be in less than 3% emissions. So I think the continent is doing more than its load now. It's up to everybody else also to make sure that they join us in the efforts that we are doing when it comes to developing our continent in a way that is also climate resilient. How many minutes do we have? Yeah. Transport is, again, or transportation in general, when it comes to sustainability, it cannot be seen as in isolation of all what's happening. Sustainability means not only that that it's sustainable, in terms of energy or in terms of lasting, but also to make sure that culturally it is sustainable. The way we are developing our transport system has also to cater for the cultural or intangible habits or intangible way of our communities are working, and make sure that this is also that the population is very well included, or the culture and the habits and the traditions are very well included into the design of sustainability of our transport systems, but also in when it comes to education. We want to make sure, and I said that earlier, that everyone is included and everyone also is able to participate in these great big projects going on the continent. This is where our education systems have to make sure that also it generates the kind of capabilities and knowledge that could be used on the continent, and this is where also capacity development kicks in. I do not wish to be too long, but when it comes to energy, digital, transport, trade, all of these are part of the elements that we need to look at. Mobility of people, mobility of goods are very important, but also the making sure that our traditions, our culture is well preserved, making sure that everyone is included, making sure that whatever we do is going to last. You know, one of the important things that made the Roman Empire, not that it's the best example, last, is that this great network of roads that made sure that the empire is very well connected, but also the design of this infrastructure that made sure that it lasts. And so the lasting aspect is also an important element that kept the empire together. With that, I call upon all of us to continue working together, to continue our partnership, to make sure that whatever we do caters for the people, for their safety, for the security, that the cost of whatever that we're going to do is affordable by all, and that no one is left behind, and that everyone, as per the SDGs, and that everyone is included as per Agenda 2063 of the African Union. And with that, I wish you an excellent conference, and I look forward to any side and all kinds of side discussions with all of you, but also look forward to the other sessions that are coming, and I thank you. So I forgot to tell you about.
I brought something for you. It's outside. It's one of those. An autonomous mini shuttle bus. We brought it on a truck because we're not allowed to drive it around. Or it's not allowed to drive itself around. Not here, anyway. But do go outside and see it. And look at it. You might even be able to get into it. Who knows? You're a transport specialist. You'll figure that out. More fun. Can you believe it? All right. We are going to be polling today and tomorrow. We're really interested in your opinion. So all you do, does anybody not have a phone? Put your hand up if you don't have a phone with you. Okay, all right, group effort then. Polev.com/TT2020. So open your phone, go there, and you will find the very first question of the conference and of the day, and it's really easy. So I'm going to put that up there so you can still remember where you're going. In a word, what are you most excited about for TT20? What are you most excited about for TT20? As you start typing in the one word that you're most excited about, we'll see a word cloud. Can someone put in lunch for me? All right, very good. Do you want to put it back up again, Polev? Yeah, all right. Very good. Oh, yeah, it's happening. So while we're doing that word cloud and you're putting the one word that you're very excited about, I have to tell you about some of the other people who are coming to the conference that are very important that I have to talk about. Maktia Diop, World Bank Vice President for Infrastructure. He has not put in the word he's most excited about, but you will hear more than that a little bit later on today. We also have Annie Dasgupta. He's the Global Director of WRI, Ross Centre for Sustainable Cities, and Sergio Aveleda, Director of Urban Mobility at the World Resources Institute. That's looking good. Very good. So much excitement. Oh, networking. I know why you're here. All right. On to the first plenary. The plenary sessions really give us a global view of some of the key issues that we want to talk about. We are going to start with plenary 1. Plenary 1 looks at the economic empowerment through the accessibility for all. we're going to unpack that a little bit. We're exploring the links between better transport and also social inclusion. To help us get started, we have David Levinson. David is going to walk up here. He's going to keep you captivated for the next 15 minutes. He's Professor for Transport, School Civil Engineering at the University of Sydney in Australia. Good morning, David.
Good morning. So I'm going to talk about access across the globe. This is a project that there are a number of co-authors with because we're looking at accessibility in a number of different places. But I'm going to first introduce the concept of accessibility and ask the question, why are we here? Or more precisely, why are we here in this particular building at this particular time? I'm here because you're here. It wouldn't make a lot of sense for me to be standing, talking, giving this talk if there weren't actually an audience. And you're here because I'm here, or someone was here, because it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense for you to be facing forward if there weren't actually someone talking to you. And at the World Bank, to be able to access the best transport professionals in the world. They're all within a short walk. You don't need golf carts or automobiles to drive within the offices of this building, at least I hope not. Even though golf carts and cars are faster than walking. So the issue is what you can reach in a given amount of time, not how fast you are going. And we can compare two basic ideas. The idea of mobility, which is the idea of how easy it is to move on a network, versus accessibility, which is how many things you can reach. And with apologies to Canada, Manitoba has very high speeds, but very few destinations. But by our standard definitions of mobility, it has very high mobility. You can move very fast across the network. There aren't speed traps every so often. There's nothing to stop you. There's not much in the way of traffic congestion outside of downtown Winnipeg, and probably not a whole lot there. In contrast, Manhattan, you have very low speeds, but there's so many destinations, you have very high accessibility. You can reach many things in a short amount of time. Access is opportunity. And modern people care about a lot of things, the most important of which is probably access to employment, at least for the half of the population that's in the workforce and those who are in their households. But we also care about access to shops and stores and other amenities and health and access to the outside world via ports and airports and so on. And so I've posited what I call a general theory of access, and that the only reason to locate anywhere is to possess resources, to be near things, or to be far from things. Okay? There's no other reason to be in any place at any time. I'm standing here to access you. I live in a particular place because it provides me convenient access to the set of services that I'm interested in. The resources question isn't very important in cities because few of us actually own farms or mines inside of cities. Not to say they don't exist, but they're not common. So the idea of generalized access measures the proximity of a place to everyone and everything else and those things that we care about. And the first step in doing this is looking at the idea of isochrones and measuring isochrones. And this is an isochrone map of Melbourne from 1923, showing how many minutes it takes to get from the Melbourne CBD to various tram stops and stations in the suburbs. Obviously, this is a hand-drawn map. And you can see in the purple areas, you can get to a lot more things in a short amount of time. And at the edge of the map, it takes a much longer time, 60 minutes, to get to the Melbourne CBD. And then there's places it takes even farther to get there via public transport. So accessibility is measured with isochrones. And what we look at is what we call a cumulative opportunities measure. Imagine you're at the white dot and you're interested in how many red dots you can reach. In 10 minutes, if our circle is 10 minutes, turns out we can't reach any of them. In 20 minutes, we can reach 2 red dots, maybe jobs. And in 30 minutes, we can reach 3 of them. Okay, this is what we're doing when we're measuring cumulative opportunities. It's a simple count of destinations. It's not an index, it's an actual thing. You know, it's not some abstract output of a model. It's something that someone could physically go and count. We can talk about 30-minute accessibility to 10,000 jobs, or the reverse, I can reach 10,000 jobs within 30 minutes. It's something I can explain to a politician. And we say jobs, well, maybe people care about things other than jobs, and we can obviously measure other things besides jobs. Jobs are just very convenient. And we can, of course, look at different time thresholds and different cost thresholds and lots of different ways of cutting this. We can look at the average accessibility for different populations that we care about. I'm going to focus on metropolitan accessibility to jobs within 30 minutes for this presentation because we have a limited amount of time. And because I'm an engineer, I have to present an equation, otherwise they take away my degree. But this is just mathematically saying what I just told you, that accessibility is the sum of the opportunities that you can reach within a given time threshold, in this case 30 minutes. So we can do maps of this using modern geographic information systems, and this is Sydney, and the red areas are not the areas that are on fire. The red areas are the areas where people live and people work, and this is the number of jobs that can be reached within 30 minutes, and you can see if you live in the eastern part of the city, you can reach a lot more jobs than if you live in the western part of the city or in the Blue Mountains, which happen to be shaded light blue here, the area where the fires actually took place. This is jobs that can be reached within 30 minutes by driving in the morning peak hours between 8 and 9. This is how many jobs can be reached by public transport. Okay, same scale. A lot fewer. This is the number of jobs that can be reached by bicycle if you are an aggressive bicyclist willing to ride on any street, which most people are not in Sydney. Bicycling is challenging and requires a lot of testosterone. And this is how many jobs you can reach by walking if you're walking along the footpath sidewalk network within Sydney. So as you can see, as in almost all cities, you can get to a lot more places by automobile than you can get by other modes. And you can get more places by bicycling than you can get by public transit, and more by public transit with walking to public transit than you can get by walking alone. And that's true almost everywhere. So what we're doing is we're taking that map and we're reducing that map to a number for each area. So we're constructing what we call person-weighted accessibility, which is just the weighted average of the accessibility in every place multiplied by how many people live in that place divided by the total number of people. And this is the last equation of the presentation. So access to jobs. Jobs are urban opportunities. It's important, jobs are an important index because obviously a lot of people have jobs. They spend more time at their jobs than at almost every other activity except at their home. But jobs are also an indicator of other types of amenities and services. Places with a lot of employment also tend to have a lot of shops and restaurants and so on. And generally more jobs are preferred to fewer, and we know that because we can see real estate markets. People who live in areas with higher accessibility pay more for their housing. And they're willing to pay more for their housing because they use the accessibility to save themselves time or to have a better choice set. Okay, so we know this. Now, how do we measure jobs is an important question. And we're looking at how the census measures jobs, and there are jobs in the informal economy that are just not going to be counted here because we don't know how many they are because they're informal by their very definition, but we acknowledge that they exist. And access explains many real-world phenomena. I mentioned property value. It explains population density. It explains commuter mode choice. Explains commute duration. It explains economic development. Okay, so access is the core variable that links transport and land use. And a generalized access measure would probably explain a whole lot more than just access to jobs within 30 minutes, but access to jobs within 30 minutes is probably the largest factor in the generalized access idea. So as part of the project with all of the co-authors I listed at the beginning, we're trying to compare accessibility globally. And we're looking at these 4 modes of travel, and right now we have 88 cities in our database. We're adding cities in Africa with some colleagues and China. And we'd be happy to add cities in other places if somebody's constructed accessibility measures that are similar to ours and comparable. And so we have since every analyst did it differently and they're using some different data sets, we have accessibility for public transport in 87 of the 88 cities we're looking at, and walking, cycling, and driving in slightly fewer data sets. Okay, so we're looking at number of jobs. We're looking at the travel time between location by the different modes. We're using OpenStreetMap to get the pedestrian and bicycle networks and to load the transit networks. And we're looking at automobile travel times using GPS data from different GPS data sources. In Australia, we used Google Maps. In the United States, we used TomTom, and so on. So we're accounting for traffic, we're accounting for congestion, we're accounting for the network structure, and we're considering where people are located at as fine a grain detail as we're able to do with the technology available. So I'll skip on the details of this, but I'm happy to talk offline about how we actually did this. So, first hypothesis, large cities, because they have mature land use, because they have more opportunities, because they have better transport infrastructure, generally have higher person-weighted access to jobs than small cities. Now, this isn't universally true. There's no guarantee that the largest city has more access within 30 minutes than a smaller city. And it's certainly not true at, say, a 10-minute level. And in the United States, the city with the highest 10-minute accessibility is Salt Lake City. You can get to more jobs in 10 minutes in Salt Lake City than you can from an average place in New York City, because New York City is crowded, because New York City has greater segregation between residences and employment overall. Second, cities from different countries and continents exhibit different ratios between their city size and their access to job. That is, that there is a type of city form that varies by location, that varies by continent. And so this is data. I don't expect you to look at it, but this is some of the input data that we have, where we have the accessibility for all of these cities. And what I'm going to show you is a graph, and this is walking access versus regional population. The walking access is on the y-axis, the population's on the x-axis using a log scale. So New York City, NYC is on the right there. And the smaller cities are on the left. And we have data for walking access for the United States, Oceania, which is Australia and New Zealand, and Europe. And there's a few things that you can see. The US cities cluster at a lower level than the European cities do. So the European cities in yellow will tend to have a higher walking access set, as people can reach more jobs in 30 minutes by walking in Europe than they can in the United States. And those people who have visited both the United States and Europe will probably not be surprised by that. And it has to do with the land use pattern in Europe. The walking speeds are assumed to be the same. And Australia and New Zealand are between the United States and Europe, which is also no surprise. If you look at the land pattern in Australian cities and New Zealand cities compared to US cities, they're denser, but they're not as dense as European cities. Same general pattern with cycling, although the accessibilities are higher because bicyclists can travel faster than pedestrians. Public transit access is also higher, and here we have data for a few other places. We have data for Brazil, which is shown in green, and Canada, which is shown in red. And Canada is more like Oceania. It sort of fits in the same scale as overlapping Vancouver and Toronto, and are similar to Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane. In terms of the general trend, US cities are much, much lower in terms of their access, although New York shows up on the right side pretty high, and Los Angeles and Chicago are also towards the right and at a reasonable elevation. And so they have more access than the smaller European cities, but not as much as the larger European cities of Paris, indicated by CDG, and London by LCY, the airport codes. So you can see some general patterns there. And in terms of automobile access in the US is really good. It's better than automobile access in Canada and in Australia and New Zealand. The motorway networks are more well developed in the US. But in a sense, they're not as good as in some of the European cities. Now, we don't have all of the European cities with automobile access, but you can see that Amsterdam even has better automobile access than Los Angeles and New York do, even though it's much, much smaller. Okay, so even though the street network might not be faster, because the land use pattern is denser and the street network is efficient enough, people can reach more jobs in Amsterdam in 30 minutes. Greater metropolitan Amsterdam, not just the walking city that you're probably familiar with if you're a tourist, than they can in New York and metropolitan New York and Los Angeles. So one of the questions is how we design our cities, and we can look at the ratio of automobile to transit access here in red. And so all of the red columns are that ratio. And if they were equal, then the ratio would be 1, and that would be the red horizontal line on the bottom there. And all of the cities are higher than 1. All of the continents are higher than 1, indicating that everywhere automobile accessibility is better than public transit accessibility, which explains why automobile use is higher than transit use. But it's so much higher in the United States than it is in Oceania, Canada, or Europe. And in fact, in Australia and New Zealand, the ratio is the lowest, although it's not by any means low. The automobile access is still much better in Australia and New Zealand than the public transit access. We can also look at the cycling to transit access, which are the green bars. That's also significantly above 1, indicating that you can get farther by a bicycle than you can by public transit in the same amount of time, almost everywhere, although in Australia and New Zealand, it's not as far as in the United States. So, our general findings. Large cities provide greater access to jobs than small cities. Overall, American cities have relatively good automobile access to jobs, but lag in walking, cycling, and public transit access. European cities have the highest access overall to jobs. Okay, but as with any study, there's issues about, there's different researchers, there's slightly different methodologies, population and jobs data come from different sources, so do the census define a job as the same in Europe as they do in the United States or in Australia? Pretty similar, but maybe not exactly the same. There's city boundary areas. How do you define a metropolitan area? That's not standardized. Data sources for your travel time estimation. We're using published transit schedules for our transit and uniform walk speeds on OpenStreetMap, which is pretty complete for the developed countries. But in GPS data for automobile times, so we think they're reasonably comparable, but there's no guarantees. And if you use different software to process the data, you might get slightly different answers. And so that could explain a little bit of the variation, although we think most of the variation is substantive. And in terms of directions, why is this? I mean, we know that some of this has to do with the land use pattern and some of this has to do with network structure, but we'd like to decompose this. So as we're designing future cities or extensions of existing cities, we can better understand how to structure the land use pattern and how to structure the networks in order to get more accessibility for less dollars of investment, and that should be good for everybody. We're in process of adding cities from Africa, China, and maybe other countries, and we suggest maybe there ought to be some sort of standardization on a number of this data sets across census, and I know that there are meetings of census organizations and so on, but there's still enough differences that make direct comparisons have a little bit of a question mark or an asterisk next to them. I'll just end with a slide. This is global accessibility in the late 1950s from a Hammond Atlas, and you can see the white areas are the areas that were considered accessible. Solid white areas indicate regions intensively developed with rail and motor transportation, and the blue areas, areas more than 20 miles from railway, motor road, navigable river, or sea. And it's pretty similar to that today, 70 years later. So, thanks.
So David, I'm going to ask you to stand there because I know that people will have some questions for you. You can ask your questions while our plenary members and our speakers do come up on stage and take a seat. You can take any of these seats apart from this one here. So plenary, come up on the stage and go to the microphone if you had a thought about what David just said. Fantastic. Great. Gentleman there, sitting right next to the microphone, very good volunteering. Just go and sit there. Stand up by that microphone just there. Just interested in the initial thoughts. Fantastic. Hello, good morning.
Good morning. Yeah,
yes,
I'm Stephen Perkins from the International Transport Forum, and I'd like to thank David for talking us through what's a simple concept and then quite complicated when you start trying to put numbers on it. And we've followed what you've been doing, and together with the European Commission and the Inter-American Development Bank, we've started to apply what you've done to try to understand the differences between cities and how access is delivered. So sometimes it's from the land use development pattern, and sometimes it's from the investment in transit and other transport modes. And that can start giving you an idea as if you want to improve the overall access, where to focus your resources and your policy. And we'll be releasing the results of this work this quarter. So we'll keep you all in touch of where to find it. But
excellent statements there, sir. I appreciate that. Very sneaky. Thank you very much. Any other thoughts? But not from you, sir. But good morning and great initiative. John, you're back.
Yes, yeah, John Wetmore, pedestrians.org. The benefits of access to jobs you know, if I have access to 100 jobs and then 1,000 jobs and then 100,000 jobs, is the additional benefit when you get up to a certain point not linear and
I'm sure it's not linear. I guess the question is how not linear is it? And there must be diminishing returns to this, and access to 1 billion jobs is probably not worth 1,000 times access to 1 million jobs. And we could probably extract the value of this through real estate markets. We haven't done that yet. I haven't seen somebody look at this, but it's sort of on the research agenda of trying to understand the nonlinearity here. But it might also be nonlinear in an increasing returns way at low levels, and that is 2 jobs may be more than twice as valuable as 1 job. And so we sort of imagine a lot of things have an S-shaped pattern. I imagine this has an S-shaped value pattern, but I don't know where the inflection points are. But I think that's an important point to keep in mind. And there's the question of, is it more important for one person to have access to 2 million jobs or 2 people to have access to 1 million jobs? And that's another kind of way of thinking about this in terms of the equity and the distribution of this. And is the distribution of the land use and the population such that many people in many different groups have access? And then there's the question of modal availability. Do you have access via public transport? Does public transport even work for you if you have limited capabilities? I think those are all issues that we need to think about. The evidence is, however, that it is increasing even at high levels. That is, the rent in New York City is higher than the rent in Winnipeg. And that's because there's so much more access in New York City. And that gives employers a way to match skills of employees better and, in theory, be more productive, at least in certain economic sectors where that's important. So I think it's increasing, but I agree that it probably has diminishing returns at the high levels.
All right, I'm going to let David have a little rest. David, walk over there to your
Thank you.
seat there. I will continue the conversation, so it's not over yet. Whenever you have a thought about what you hear on stage, you know where those 2 microphones are. Just go ahead, stand there, because it's easier to remember what you want to say at the time than right at the very end of the conversation. Hello, plenary. It's so good to see you. I am about to give you the opportunity to give you the best introductions you've ever had in your life, because you're going to do them yourselves. Good morning, Minister. Good morning. Where's your microphone? There we go. I'm not a science major, but I could work that one out. I am guessing they put the microphone on. Don't touch it. Let's see if that works.
It works.
Yes, it does. Fantastic. All right. Good morning, Minister. Retake.
Good morning. Good morning.
All right. Minister, your fantastic introduction is what?
Well, my fantastic introduction.
Who are you? I know,
Mawit.
but you do
Okay.
it for the audience.
All right.
Yes.
I'm Dag Mawit. I'm the Minister of Transport of Ethiopia, and I'm glad to be here, being part of TT20.
Thank you very much. Young Tae, pick up a microphone.
Okay.
Excellent introduction.
I think I'm a connected man because now currently I'm serving as a Secretary General of the International Transport Forum, but before that I was working in the Korean government in the Ministry of Infrastructure and Transport and handling a lot of issues, and including non-transport sectors like housing and urban planning and etc. So I think I can contribute from non-transport the perspective as well.
Etienne is looking very relaxed because he doesn't think it's the microphone's coming to him for another 2 goes, but he's wrong. Pick up the microphone, Etienne. Good morning.
Hi.
We're all about disruption in this conference.
Yeah, you said you would surprise us. Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Etienne Krug, and I'm Director for Social Determinants at the World Health Organization. And thanks for having a modest medical doctor amongst you transport experts. I'm not a transport expert, but I come from the community that deals with things when things go wrong and people get killed, disabled, or injured on the road.
Good morning, Lake. Tell the audience who you are.
Hi. I'm Lake Zagaris, and even though a lot of people don't believe it, I'm actually Chilean. I've lived there for the past 40 years, so all my adult life. I started as a Canadian, and I learned urbanism fighting a highway project, and then went on and did a master's and doctoral degree. And I'm now very honored to participate within the BRT Plus Center of Excellence, the Center for Sustainable Urban Development and Transport Engineering, of all places, at the Catholic University of Chile.
Hello, Pamela.
Hi, everyone. My name is Pamela Smith. I'm a Peruvian lawyer, and I work for a non-profit organization. Its name is SODIS, Disability and Society, and we basically work on transportation issues, inclusive education, and all the issues regarding disability.
So those are the titles, but it's always good when you're watching a plenary and you're taking part in the plenary, is who represents what? What are they doing? Why are they on the stage and why am I not on the stage? Because we have so much expertise in the room in this conference. So I challenged our plenary speakers to tell us one story, one anecdote that made them valuable to be in this conversation. Hello, Lake.
Well, mine is pretty simple. As a child, I loved adventure stories and I wanted an adventurous life. And one of the most amazing stories that comes back to me over and over again is through the looking glass. So when you're a woman and you go into transportation, you think, oh my gosh, if I start talking about women's issues and children, I'm so going to get stereotyped and ghettoized. And it's true, that does happen a bit. But on the other hand, it's really like walking through the mirror into a whole other world with a whole other set of potential. And that's certainly the case when you take this opposite positionality to look at transport. So just two examples. One, starting from David's presentation, is wow, if you had figures from the global south for that, I think we would find some really interesting and very different results, because unlike the developed countries or the global north countries that were selected there, what you have is countries where walking is still the majority transport mode, cycling is battling for a significant share of travel, and public transport is really massive. It's not just mass transit as a name, it really is. Santiago doesn't have programming of buses because they come all the time. They're every few minutes. You can't schedule that. They're just there in the best cases. And the same with women. When we start looking at transport systems from the perspective of gender and of women, what we find is that, oops, employment trips are not the majority of trips in most cities.
You sneakily started to have the discussion and you dovetailed your story into, and now I'm going to take charge of the conversation.
No, I'm not.
I'm just going to pass the microphone along to the Minister. Yeah, David, go ahead.
So the first point is we do have data from Brazil, and if you have data for Chile, we'd be happy to add it, and we're working on adding other countries. Work trips aren't the majority trips for men either. They're not the majority of trips for anybody, but it is the place that the most out-of-home time is spent, and that's why it's so critical. But yes, clearly we should be looking at the access to all of the other destinations that people care about. But the other thing you'll note is that jobs will tend to be concentrated farther away in employment centers, whereas stores and shops and schools will tend to be more spread among the population, so there's less differentiation in the access to other opportunities than there is in differentiation to access to jobs. And so that's one of the reasons that we look at jobs in addition to, the drunk where the light post is. You look for your keys because that's where the data is, mixing the metaphors a little bit there. But the idea of, if we have all of this data, we can look at it, but if we don't have this data, we can't do the comparison, and that's sort of where we still are and why we need to continue to do this kind of research.
Pamela, you're looking so thoughtful. Pick up that microphone. What were you thinking?
Well, if I have to mention a story that links disability, inclusion, and transportation, the story of the Metropolitano massive rapid bus lane in Peru comes up to my mind when the construction, on the announcement of the construction of this system was one of the major announcements in the transport area in the past decade in Peru. And it was also seen as an opportunity for persons with disabilities, since they were mainly excluded from the mainstream transport system. And even though they participated actively in all the processes, in consultations, and the system was presented as accessible it was not. And the case of a particular woman who's a wheelchair user draws the situation pretty good. She was informed that the system was pretty accessible, and that's the reason she decided to use one of the feeder buses of the Metropolitano. She had some issues while she was trying to get into the bus. Once inside, she noticed that some security measures were inadequate, and the safety belt wasn't there. She ended up falling down inside the bus, hit by her own wheelchair, and due to an abrupt braking of the bus. So, and I'm bringing up the story because I think that it gives a better sense of how accessibility impact the lives of people with disabilities on daily basis. And that's why it's very important to look at this issue very carefully and to include the voices of persons with disabilities in these processes.
Minister, you're nodding so much. Young Tae, please give the Minister your microphone.
Thank you very much. I'm here because of the issue of accessibility. And as it has been mentioned in the keynote, our people, which is nearly 80% of our people, is living in the rural area in my country. We're about more than 100 million in a big country, which is 1.1 million square kilometer. And when we say connectivity and accessibility, my people, or the people in my country, because they're not connected, because they don't get access to the basic health facilities, to education, and above all, to the market, as we are agrarian, majority of the production that they produce in the agriculture cannot get access to the market. And even because of that, while they are living in a very fertile land, and while they are able to produce minimum 4 times a year, they're producing nearly 1 time a year. And they're not using their time for production, because even if they produce, they cannot take it to the market. The market is not accessible. And this is contributing a lot for the challenge that we are in. And we believe we need to work on connectivity, and there are lots of things that we are working on, including the Universal Rural Road Access Program that we're doing in our country. And because of that, we are seeing some results, and we're here, and I'm here to share that aspect.
I love results. Young Tae, please pick up a microphone that's nearest to you. Very good.
Okay, so anecdote?
You ruined the surprise now, but you can do one. Go ahead.
Okay. I think it's time to go beyond the transport sector, because why I'm here, especially for meeting people from non-European sectors, because sometimes the solution for transport sector comes from non-transport sector. So recently, you see what's happening in Paris, where I live, and there's a general strike since December 5th, and we usually talk about good things about public transport system, but once it goes wrong, I think we have to find other solutions. But the problem didn't come from transport sector itself, it comes from other sectors, because it came from the discussions on pension reform and etc. So I think it's time to go to find another solution. I always say this: if you go to Oriental Clinic and if you have a headache, and the doctor will give a shot to acupuncture on your feet, on your belly instead of your head, because they are looking for the real cause. So when we try to find solution, we have to look around and to promote discussions with non-transport experts.
Etienne.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't really want to tell an anecdote about myself, because I think that's not very interesting, but I want to give a voice to those who don't really have one, which is those who either have been killed on the road or severely disabled, or their families. We at WHO are in touch on a weekly, if not daily basis with the families of those who have died on the road. And I am struck, I think, on every occasion by how devastating these consequences are not just the week or the month or the year after this happens, but 5, 10, 15, 20 years after, these fathers, these mothers, these siblings are still totally devastated and feeling unheard. So I'm here really to make a plea for road safety. And frankly, I was surprised in the opening session of this event. I was ready to tweet the World Bank colleague when he said, we have 3 criteria from now on for all of our projects, because I was sure he was going to say safety, in addition to environment, Africa, etc. Safety wasn't mentioned, so please, since he invited us to make recommendation, here's my first. Add safety to your list of criteria for every project you look at. Thank you.
So I'm going to say this for the room and also for our speakers up here on stage. Whenever you want to ask a question, you ask it. This conversation is for you, it is not for me. And we're talking about accessibility, and Young Tae, you were thinking about, let's think about different ways of maybe approaching this challenge. And Karen Vega is online right now, and she's thinking about accessibility in a very different way. She said, wouldn't it might be better to not go to places, but for the places to go to you? So digitizing more jobs, because then your job is right there. Young Tae, talk about accessibility.
Yeah, I think we have to change our perceptions on the notions that we kept for a long time in the past, because accessibility, now we have to replace that maybe by the word connectivity. So in the case, something comes to me and I can go there, it means that we are all connected, as we mentioned at the beginning. That's why we are replacing transport today by the word mobility. So now every notion of traditional meaning is evolving, and now we have to face a new the stage of creating our new perception and new thinking. Otherwise, we might be stuck in the dogma and in our traditional thinking.
I think, Pamela, for you, accessibility is so important because you're working with communities who don't have or who are differently abled. Do you want to explain to me what accessibility means for your work?
Accessibility is it plays a key role in the development of fair societies, at least for the group of persons with disabilities. There's a deep link between inclusion, transportation, and persons with disabilities. In fact, accessibility could be portrayed as the entrance door for inclusion, and especially for those marginalized groups as persons with disabilities. And also through accessible systems and through transportation, will enable people with disabilities to go to school, to go to work, to engage in any social activity as everyone else, and they are deprived to do so at this moment. And the lack of transportation and accessible transportation, it continues segregation. So as long as it remains inaccessible, we don't promote inclusion for this large and marginalized group in society.
David, you're a professor of transport and civil engineering. You have the Minister of Transport of Ethiopia here in the room. What would you be curious about asking her?
So I guess, we have a lot of priorities in the transport sector. We talk about we're designing a system for access rather than mobility. So in Ethiopia, you identified the problem of farm-to-market type of issues, and it's inefficient, and so farmers can't produce as much as, or the market won't accept as much as they would be able to produce if they had better accessibility. How are you going to give them better accessibility?
Very good one. One of the things that we have done is to engage our people in one program that we call the Universal Rural Road Access Program. And in doing so, most of the activities was done by the community themselves, because they know the problem. And we injected small amount of capital, and they engage their labor, and they do the road. And by doing so, by engaging them, We plan to connect nearly about 15,602 rural districts, and we succeeded to connect 12,000 of them, which is nearly 76%. And in addition to that, they were able to engage nearly more than 2.7 billion per contribution, both in cash and in labor. And when we engage the people based on the real problems that they have, the collaboration and the engagement is going to be very significant. And this is what we have seen. So now most of our districts are connected, but still we have areas and pockets which are not yet connected. If we do so, we believe that the productivity will increase. And as a country which is importing a significant amount of grains from outside, while having a fertile land that we can produce by ourselves, definitely this connectivity issue is going to address the real challenge of our problem, which we already identified as a government and working on this particular aspect.
And as a follow-up, I mean, as the agricultural sector becomes more productive, it requires fewer people, which in countries around the world has led to increased urbanization as people move from rural areas into cities. So what's going to happen to Addis as many of these people find the opportunities in the cities are more lucrative than in the rural areas? How are the cities going to accommodate this huge influx of a rural population?
Yeah, we need to think of how we're going to urbanize and the settlement pattern that we need in the cities, and all other issues are expected to be intertwined parallelly while we're doing this. And obviously we are working on that aspect as well, because we have a ministry which is fully responsible to design the settlement pattern depending upon the flow of people that we have from rural to urban centers.
So just a couple of reflections on that, and going back to the reversing the positionality. That doesn't mean that everything in the original is invalid. I'm a fan of the Transportist, and one of my resolutions for this year is to have more time to read it, not just scan it. So two things related to this. We really, when we talk about connectivity, all of a sudden we're assuming that we're talking about highways for cars and motorized vehicles. And in fact, a lot of the connections for agriculture are not just motorized vehicles, and in developing countries, having to have an individually owned motorized vehicle to move your stuff is really complicated. In Temuco, in southern Chile, oxen to move the cochayuyo, which is a kind of algae, to the markets. Our highways are excluding. They're not sustainable, they're not safe. And the reason is because we think a highway is only for motorized vehicles, and they have no walking infrastructure and no cycling infrastructure. If they have no walking and no cycling infrastructure, they are not sustainable, they are not a contribution to human development, they are an aberration, or they should be an aberration in the 21st century. For all these different reasons. Someone once said to me, no, but people who walk, they're not going from the capital to someplace 10,000 miles away. No, but they still need to connect, and they should have a priority because way more people have feet than have cars. So
hopefully the people have feet.
Sorry, I just want to take that thought into new urban settlements as well, because we had a really interesting conversational and analytical project between neighborhood leaders, transport engineers, and planners, and the basic building block of any city, no matter how large or how small, is the neighborhood. You can't segregate walking and segregate cycling and segregate buses in the neighborhood. You have to segregate cars. You have to take them out of areas where people live, where children need to play, where we need more green space, because the infrastructure for cars also destroys the space for urban forestation, for developing food, for growing our own food, which gives us resilience in these very troubled times.
Etienne, pick up on the safety aspect, because I know that is so critical for you, and tie it back into economic development, if there were fewer deaths on the road.
Yeah, no, I mean, I couldn't agree more with what was just said. I mean, it's so true. If we accept a situation which is totally unacceptable. I mean, if today somebody arrived and said, look, I have a new invention, a new transport system. It's really great. It's fun, it's fast, it allows us to go anywhere we want. There's just a little hiccup. 1.35 million people are going to die every year when they use it. Half of them will be those who use it, and half of them who just at the wrong place at the wrong time. And by the way, it's going to be the leading cause of death for young children and young adults. Would we accept it? No sane government would say, yeah, go ahead, just develop it. No, not at all. It would not happen. But it is there, and we accept it. And we live with it, and we barely talk about it in view of the enormous issue it is. So yes, we have to move away from a car-based transportation system. It kills, it injures, it disables, and it pollutes, and it's unhealthy also in terms of coronary disease, heart attacks, stroke, cancer, diabetes, etc., because it's basically a passive mode of transport. So making space for walking, for cycling, for good, safe public transport is the only way forward. And in terms of economic, as you ask, I mean, it's the same. We want to promote connectivity, of course. We want to facilitate transportation of goods, of course. But if it kills, if it becomes the #1 killer of our young people, these are young fathers, young mothers, the breadwinners of the family, who suddenly either disappear or end up in a wheelchair, disabled, needing a lot of surgery, rehabilitation services, etc. Huge cost to society, huge cost to the family. So is that really good for the economy? I'm not so sure.
Who argues against you? How do you argue against you? Because the road safety figures are horrific.
First of all, most of them don't argue at all because they don't talk about it. Some argue against in the sense that, yes, there is a pleasure to using cars. There is an economic market there to produce cars, to sell cars, and of course that creates tensions if you want to reduce that economic income.
And I mean, I agree completely, but one of the things we need to keep in mind is that this is not an entirely unsolvable problem. We just choose not to solve it. So you can look at a country like Norway, which has radically reduced the number of vehicle deaths. I think they had one last year or something like that, one pedestrian death last year in a country of 5 million people, compared to other countries, which, you know, state of New South Wales, which is in the hundreds of deaths. I mean, they're 99% better. Getting it down to zero is a laudable goal, and we should definitely state that as a goal. But we're not making significant improvements in any real way, and many of the improvements that we've had in terms of reduced fatalities are due to the improvements in the medical system and faster response time to crashes, not because the roads and vehicles are better, or certainly not because drivers are more careful, or we have environments in which they behave better. So this gets into all sorts of design questions, which are everyone in the engineering community understands this at an intellectual level, but it's very hard to persuade people who are drivers and politicians to implement the kinds of regulations that are needed in order to change the way that we're doing things in a number of countries. And you can just look at the difference in road death statistics across countries and see that it's a cultural problem as much as anything.
We are going to be talking more about this with a young woman called Zuleika Mandela. She's the granddaughter of Nelson Mandela, and her story that connects her to the advocacy for reducing road deaths is something that you will want to hear later on this morning. I want to push on a little bit, though. It's a very important topic. And Etienne, bring us back whenever you feel you need to. But for Jongtae, if we're looking at resilient transport systems, I know that's something that you wanted to share with the plenary. Why?
I think one of the challenges in the transport sector is that sometimes we become too much ideological. So we already think about our final destination, where to go, in what direction we're moving. So it's a good thing. It's a good thing because we know the destination. But basically the difficulty lies in the procedure on the way to the destination. So when we talk about public transportation, for example, we usually think it's a good thing and we have to remove cars and we have to encourage people to use that. But if public transport system is not really stable and credible, then how can we make people use that more? So in that sense, we need a resilient system in terms of technological aspect and in terms of a social aspect. That's why I mentioned that we need to think about non-transport aspect as well. But I know that in every country, every system is different, and there should be a really efficient governance system. So sometimes when we talk about transport system, it's easy to say that we need construct more infrastructure, provide more services, but who pays for what, that should be discussed. And also, we have several values that are in the conflicting situations. So we very much put economic aspect rather than social aspect, or depending on the collective consensus in each society, sometimes we value more the social aspect than economic aspect. So I think...
I'm not hearing examples, so I'm hearing statements but no examples. I would love to hear some examples.
For example, when I was in the Ministry of Transport, working as a civil servant for transport infrastructure, we usually do some benefit cost analysis before we really make a decision. But during that time, we very much focused on the economic aspect. So the money really matters at the time. But now we know that there should be more than money. So we think about environment. We think about the integrity and the citizens' equal right, and especially women in transport. So I think what we can think is important for this kind of conversation is that we try to confirm once again the several values that can be shared and that can be agreed on by all of us, and a lot of policymakers can keep those values in their mind when they plan something. So in that sense, I think we need to discuss more.
Lake, pick up the point about women in transport. I'm not sure that that is a consideration as transport systems are developed.
Wow, I sort of went off on a whole other tangent there, but maybe I can make a connection. The roads exist. We don't have to keep investing in new roads. I mean, I know this varies a lot by place, so take that into consideration. But in many cases, they exist. But what we have is automobility, which is non-sustainable transport, which has been sold like smoking. Right? This didn't just happen. It's not automatic. We've got billions and billions of dollars of advertising that tell us that driving a car is to be independent. Just the same, it's to be in contact with nature and all this. We're not so clear on what is sustainable transport, huh? There's a tendency to think that it's, public transport. But we all know, anybody, and women know better than anyone else, that public transport alone is more of a challenge and a mountain to climb than a real help in your daily life in many places. There are many exceptions, but in general, because if I'm carrying the week's groceries and I have 2 small children, or maybe someone who's disabled who I'm accompanying, then even half a kilometer from the metro stop or the bus stop to my house is a pretty steep hill to climb. So we need to think of sustainable transport as an ecology of modes. Walk, bike, bus are the basic. Each of them has a niche. No single one of them is going to replace all of automobility. But together, when they interact effectively, when we have intermodal rather than multimodal transport systems, we have a sustainable transport system. So what happens there? Cycling isn't just something for cyclists, although we do love it, those of us who cycle a lot. Cycling is the missing link. Because cycling isn't just a personal bike, it's a cycle taxi. It's an electro-assisted taxi that can take you half a kilometer, that short trip, without polluting the way a motorized taxi would, without costing what a motorized taxi would. And that's very important for all of us, but particularly low-income people and particularly women who have all these multiple tasks that they have to perform.
I am just going to open up the microphones now. The microphones will be live. As we're having this conversation, don't feel self-conscious. Just go ahead, walk over there. When I see you, I'll include you in the conversation, so we're not just hurrying at the very last minute at the end. Pamela, you have a particular concern about accessibility, because it's accessibility for people who may have different challenges of getting around and moving around. What are you asking? What are you pushing for? What do we need to be thinking about?
Okay, so first of all, I think that many people with disabilities rely on transportation and on public transportation to get around the cities and engage in activities as any other. So one of the main issues is to understand accessible systems as a system. So even if the infrastructure, station wagons are accessible, and many of us might think that it's enough, we need to look a little bit further and think about how do people actually get to those stations and get to the metro or whatever is in place if the surrounding areas are not accessible at all. So that there's a gap there, and this gap is not contributing to their inclusion. And also the engagement and the role of civil society organizations and organizations of persons with disabilities. They should be seen as an ally and as a primary source of information. So their contributions might help to actually improve projects because they are the ones who face the challenge and the barriers on a daily basis. So following up mechanisms in the projects and the execution of projects are needed to be there. And this way we ensure that systems that might not be intended to exclude anyone are actually including everyone.
Okay. I love that you're standing behind the microphones. This is fantastic. I would like you to set the standard for what a question is. A question is not advertising your platform. A question is talking to the plenary speakers and adding to the conversation. And then when you're out there networking over your coffee and your lunch, that's when you can expand on your organization and then do your PSA. Is that okay? Does that make sense? Fantastic. Good morning, sir. Let's try it out.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I'm called Arnold from Cameroon. In most developing countries, it's a known fact that technology competes with technology. But when you get to Africa, everything competes with food. That means in your design thinking, whatever you're designing, you have to take into account the fact that whatever you're bringing into the market has to compete with food. Now I'm asking the Minister of Transport from Ethiopia and the African Union lady, most infrastructure projects in Africa always come at an extra cost to the populations. If you have to look, for instance, the distance from Douala, Cameroon, to Lagos in Nigeria, it's about 1,100 kilometers. And I paid in September for a trip to Lagos. In December, I paid about $1,000 to get to Lagos. The same distance from Paris to Berlin, I paid less than $300. If we keep building this infrastructure that is neither affordable to us African populations, of what essence is it building this infrastructure when the populations cannot afford to get on board this infrastructure you're building?
Minister, go ahead. You're building, some parts of Africa may be building infrastructure that people who live there cannot afford to use.
Yeah. That's very true. Even if we have the accessibility, unless and otherwise it is affordable by the citizens, it's going to be maybe meaningless to have it in the first place. So what we need to do is that we need to keep on designing different alternatives, different modes of transport, to be able to use it as a competitive alternative. For instance, we can think of having land transport along that of the railway and aviation, and different kinds of modes of transport should be availed. And in the meantime, I believe it has to be subsidized to some extent, especially when it comes to public transport. it should be subsidized, because mobility by itself is going to support the economy through the transaction of the goods and services that we do by utilizing the modes of transport that we have. So the ultimate solution is enhancing, increasing different alternatives that we have, and meanwhile subsidizing it so that it could be affordable by the community could be a short-term solution that we need to look into.
Thank you, Minister. Hand your microphone to Young Tae. Young Tae, what were you writing on your paper?
I think I was writing about interaction between infrastructure development and the demand for using that infrastructure. Because sometimes in a developing country, for example, when we want to make an economic development, we usually invest for infrastructure creation, because it can also create jobs and it can also create something good for the society. But if the demand is not that high, that basically it's relatively less productive. So how we can create also the demand for the new infrastructure or existing infrastructure. So for example, the question relating to affordability, that can be also be solved if we create more demand, or it can make costs down in the end. So I just writing that.
That was a good note. Was that just for yourself? I'm glad we shared it. Yes, Lake, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add something to this mix, because we're not talking about who, we're talking about what. And who is really central to how we transition. So just to give an example here of why that's important, we had a very nice seminar it was streamed live, and we had people from all over the world in Temuco a couple of years ago. And one of our sponsors was a technological company that was doing the smart cards in the region and so on. So it was really interesting, and there was a wealth of detail. And at one point, this woman on a wheelchair sort of came in, with an odd little bundle on her lap, and settled in at the back of the room and was listening and listening. And there was all this hype about the technology and how wonderful it was and all that stuff. And all of a sudden we heard this cry, and she had a baby on her lap. So talking to her, she was a woman who was doing a PhD in technology, and what she was doing was developing a route finder around the city to deal with accessibility issues, so that women and other people who are mobility impaired could they could share the routes that they were discovering and inventing, and share them with the regional transport authorities, so that they could actually identify very quickly, and without hiring a big expensive consultant, they could figure out where the bottlenecks were and how to fix them. So I think it's really valuable what technology companies bring to the mix, but we really need to focus on the people who aren't at the table, because they are often the voices that are going to bring originality and innovation and changes, small changes that accumulate and really make massive changes in the quality of people's lives.
Hello.
Hello, I'm Michael Replogel. I'm Deputy Commissioner for Policy at the New York City Department of Transportation. Congratulations on a very successful start to this program today. And I wanted to take note that the remarks by the Managing Director for Operations at the World Bank, saying that the typical transport project of the future will be climate smart, inclusive, with a focus on the poorest and most vulnerable. And that's a breathtaking statement coming from the World Bank, which has often focused on big infrastructure projects and is under huge pressure to move a lot more money into infrastructure. And often it's hard to do that with projects that are small, decentralized, that serve pedestrians and cyclists and better access to public transport. And often the bottleneck for getting those projects serving the poor, serving environmental and transport sustainability, is in the country plan process. Every several years, the country directors for the multilateral development banks sit down with national finance ministries and other national leaders of countries to say, in broad sketches, what kind of investments will be made. And it's at that early stage that a lot of the unsustainable investments go into the pipeline, and then it becomes hard to move towards sustainability. I'd like to ask the official from Ethiopia and others on the panel for ideas of how we can influence and shift this process so that we can get sustainability concerns brought into the earliest stages of creating the pipeline for project financing, and to better empower the voices of the poor, the disempowered, those who walk, those who cycle, those who don't have access to cars, so that their transport needs are better met in the investments of multilateral development banks and the private sector.
I'm going to wrap you up there, so we've got time to answer your question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, sir. Take a seat. That could be talking about the World Bank process, or actually any long financial process. It takes a long time from starting the conversation to implementation. Who wants to take that on briefly? A couple of people can do that. Etienne, you start.
Well, I don't have the full answer, but I certainly can say what I think. I've been coming to the bank for 20 years. I remember the first time I came here was probably 2002 or 1, knocking on the door of the transport director and saying, you should do something on road safety. And they looked at me a bit strange, but yeah, maybe. And so I want to congratulate, first of all, the bank, because I think there's been a huge evolution. Road safety is now on the agenda. There is quite a bit of work happening in the bank and the other development banks on this topic. So that's a good thing. But it's not yet enough. We have to go further. When we say we're going to have projects to support the poor, I want to see the fine print. What does that mean? Does that mean build a road to a poor village and that's it? Or does it mean also taking into account then all the consequences of that, and that those who were walking to school on a dirt road now are pushed to the side because cars are going to drive through because we're helping the poor? So I think one of the answers will be to really go into further detail, have clear checklists, and I applaud, of course, the idea that there will be no more projects that are not environmentally sound. There should be no more infrastructure projects that are not road safety sound, and it should be one of the central criteria, not just an afterthought or a little thing on the side. And I know the banks are moving towards that, but we could move faster and probably in more depth than we are now.
Pamela, you're looking at me.
Yeah, I can see. Yes, so I don't have a fully answer either, but I think that there's a chance to impact on the projects when they're at the very beginning. And the first thing that comes up to my mind is through consultations, and it was mentioned by colleagues. Like trying to put into the documents and as a checklist, the contributions and concerns raised by DPOs, civil society organizations might be crucial in the design of the project. So at the end, we don't end up with a project that didn't include those concerns and contributions, and it has to be redesigned or remodeled. And basically was the case, well, bringing up again the Peruvian case, when the Metropolitano was finished through a donation, one station was remodeled, and it could have been avoided. Of course, there's progress, and in the following projects, consultations and meaningful consultations, and I emphasize on meaningful, were carried out, and final documents on the last project, the Metro Line 2 in Lima, Peru, finally included the contributions raised up by civil society organizations. So that's one way we can have projects that are benefit actually everyone.
So we're going to do this quickly because we have people standing up, and quite a lot of people, and I want to get them all in before the coffee break. Minister, pick up that microphone and read the notes that you put on your note paper.
I was appreciating the issue of sustainability in the transport. And to be able to bring sustainability and with respect to transport, I think as a country, I was writing that we can use the latecomer advantage that we have, because concerning the road connectivity, what we have done so far, when we compare it with the thing that we need to do in the future, then the things that we need to do in the future is much more higher than what we have done so far. So as a latecomer, we will be able to entertain this issue of sustainability and entertain this aspect in the actions that we're going to take forward.
I know you have more to say, but so do our audience. So thank you for your patience. You've been waiting there for 10 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Angela van der Kloof. I'm from the Netherlands, where I work as a consultant. I want to build upon the statement that Lake Sagaris made, saying that we need to move away from multimodal to intermodal. And I would like to add to that up to now, I haven't heard about the mix of bicycling and public transport. Because I think if you start thinking about, we have public transport, but we allow people to come to the stations by bicycle, the catchment area of the whole public transports explodes, and you have many more opportunities, and this idea of accessibility starts to change. And I'm bringing this up because this is my personal experience as well as my professional experience. So I would like to include this thinking to the panel, and maybe some of the panelists want to reflect on that.
Who wants to do some reflection? Young Tae, go ahead.
I think we have to change the notion of public transport system, as I said before, because nowadays we see a lot of new personal mobility devices and new mobility system in our society. So, for example, if we apply the notion of shared economy to the transport sector, we can easily change the notion to a broader context. For example, if we share the bike, or if we share the taxi, or if we share the new scooters or trottinette, it becomes the public transport system. That's totally different from what we thought in the past. So nowadays, thanks to the technological development, we can change and have more flexibility in the definition of a public transport system.
David, briefly, have you heard anything that's been bold or innovative in the last hour, other than your good self?
Well, let me just respond to, I think if we define the public transport system as everything, we're defining it as nothing. I mean, if we're going to say that a shared bike is public transport, then a shared car is also public transport. And if a shared car is public transport and I'm the one who uses it all the time because it's parked in front of my house, even though I don't own it, I think public transport has a meaning of moving multiple people on a single vehicle in a particular direction at a particular time, and we should probably keep that definition. And many public transport operators have a tough enough time doing that if they start to spread their fingers into other areas, they're not going to be doing any of these very well. Getting back to the question of bicycle-connected public transport, I think that's an interesting idea, and the Netherlands does it very well, and Sydney, Australia does that very poorly, for example, because we don't have in much of the United States or Canada or Australia good bicycle networks and a culture that supports bicycling. We have a culture that's antagonistic to bicycling, that fines bicyclists for not wearing helmets, that forces bicycles either to be in high-speed traffic or on footpaths, and makes it very uncomfortable. And so bicycle-connected public transport is important, and that falls out of having a good bicycling network so that people connect from point to point in the first place. But that's not the kind of investment that should be attracting World Bank money. That's something that should be done locally. That we don't need an international investment plan for bicycle networks.
David, take a pause. Lake wants to have an argument with you.
I don't want to have an argument with him, but I do disagree with you very deeply. And I'll just give an example. Because of the way that Transantiago was implemented, there's $800 million worth of subsidies available to regional governments in Chile who want to invest in public transport. And the regional authorities, who have very limited bus transport systems, are desperate to implement public bike share and bicycle taxis that could connect rural bus stops to regional regional hospitals, and so on and so forth. So I think that it's perfectly realistic that different formats of bicycles should be a part of public transport. And from a women's point of view and a gender point of view, that's particularly important. And here is another related point, and that is that a lot of people think integrating bikes with public transport is just having bike parking nearby. But there's a whole set. Most of North America now has carriers for bikes that are very quick and efficient to use. What that means for a woman, for example, who has to work a night shift in a developing country like Chile, is that she doesn't have to stand and wait for a long time at 2 or 3 or 5 in the morning for the bus to come. She can take her bike, take it to a trunk route or a main route or a metro route, depending what's available. She can take her bike on that route, get off the bike, instead of having to walk across a probably dangerous bridge where she's in danger of being mugged or attacked. She can get on her bike and zip across and be home in 5 minutes instead of 15 minutes. And that reduces her exposure and her vulnerability in very practical ways. So intermodality, bike-bus integration has a lot of different components. They're absolutely realistic. You get a big bang for your little bucks, and there's something that the World Bank should be encouraging actively everywhere it's funding any kind of transport project.
I anticipate a very lively conversation during the coffee break. All right, let's do this fast. I want you all to ask your questions. Your questions will be short. The answers will be short. Hello at the back.
Yeah, John Weltman, pedestrians.org. We just finished a decade of action on road safety. Road deaths still went up. How did we fail? How can we do better in the next decade?
I guess this is for me. First of all, I don't think we have totally failed. A lot of things have happened during the decade. At the beginning of the decade, there was a projection that by 2020, we would have moved up from 1.2 million deaths per year on the road to 1.9. We're not at 1.9, we're at about 1.3, 1.4 right now. So that's better than what was anticipated. That's progress, that's good. But you're right, we didn't go far enough. We had hoped for a 50% reduction from the projected increase, so to be at about 800, 900,000 right now, and we're not. So much more is needed. I think one, political will. We know what needs to happen. It's not rocket science. It's not easy, but we know that it's about improving the vehicles. It's about safe infrastructure for all road users. It's about good laws and enforcement of laws. It's about better trauma care, better data, good management. A whole system needs to be put in place. And this can only happen if there is top-level decision-making on that issue. If Norway managed to get, or if Oslo had 0 deaths for children, bicyclists or pedestrians last year, or Norway almost no pedestrian deaths, it's because there is top-level support in the country, not just one minister or one department, but really the heads of governments are involved. So I think we need better political will, and we need to really implement what works. In addition to that, we need to move to other systems of transportation which are much more focused on walking, cycling, and safe public transport, which of course is going to take some time, but that decision also needs to be taken, and we need to start moving towards that. So I think we have learned a lot of lessons during the decade, and we will discuss in a few weeks, on 19 and 20 February in Stockholm at the 3rd Global Ministerial Conference on Road Safety, how to plan for the next 10 years. But I'm quite hopeful that actually we can make better and faster progress in the next 10 years.
You can ask during the coffee break what Jung Tae has on his notepad, but for now I'm going to go to the next question. I'm determined to get both in before the coffee break. Good morning. Hello.
Thank you. My name is Joseph Luna. I'm an economist and political economy advisor at the U.S. Department of Transportation. I imagine many of you on the stage spend a lot of your time in meetings with stakeholders, bringing together politicians or NGOs or other groups. And in any of these meetings, we have the groups who we think would support us or might oppose us in our advocacy. Could you tell us of the time when you were meeting with a group of people who you thought would oppose what you were doing, but then actually turned out to come around?
That is such a fantastic question. Leave it there. I love that. Who wants to? It's got to be a good story. Who's going to tell us? All right. Who's got one? All right, Lake, you do. Like, Pamela, tell us your good story. When you were expecting pushback and you got what?
At least in the conversations we had in Peru regarding the projects funded by the World Bank, sometimes we expected that authorities wouldn't understand the issues and will have to push very hard for them to implement changes and accept contributions of civil society organizations. But at the end, sometimes we found out that they don't know about the issue. They don't understand. They never interact with persons with disability. They don't know their needs and their concerns. The fact of communicating them and to raising up the issue just produced the change. So that's why it's important to hear the voices of those affected by the barriers. And sometimes, at least in our case, communicating what happened, what are the needs of these marginalized groups worked very well, and the government understood. It didn't happen all the time, and civil society had to push very, very hard in this sort of situations. Government is more likely to hear the bank rather than civil society, but it worked at the end in a few situations.
All right, nice story, love that. And excellent question, thank you. Hello, sir.
Good morning. My name is Norman Garrick, Professor of Transportation Engineering at the University of Connecticut. I really think it's important we're talking about connection and access, but I'm a little bit surprised at the discussion here because I think we are being seduced somewhat by the title of this forum. The issue that is not being discussed here is the disastrous way that we are urbanizing in lots of places all around the world. Bikes, buses, etc., don't work with the type of urbanization that we're getting all over the world, including the developing world. So we need to be talking about urbanization as part of the solution, including a solution to the problem of traffic fatality. So that's all I wanted to leave you with.
Thank you. I feel that's like throwing a grenade in the room and then exiting really fast, but very thought-provoking. David, yeah, that's your territory.
And that's exactly right. And when we talk about accessibility, it's the connection between transport and land use and the land pattern. And if local governments or state governments or national governments permit certain types of land development and subsidize certain types of land development, you're going to get that. And if that land development is counterproductive from a safety perspective, from an equity perspective, from an accessibility perspective, this subsidy it compounds itself over time. And I think that this is something that needs to be front and center in decision making at all levels of government. And the subsidies for this kind of development hidden through public capital works that provide freeways that support this kind of development, or capital investment in public schools in suburban areas when there's empty schools inside of densely developed areas, or new water trunk lines and new sewage trunk lines to support new areas for development when there's capacity in existing areas, provided for free, is going to encourage this kind of development and lower accessibility by walking, by biking, and by public transport.
Congratulations, plenary speakers. You are trending in DC. Hashtag TTDC20. You obviously said stuff that was so fascinating that people were tweeting and retweeting. I will allow you in the coffee break to check your Twitter feed. But for now, delegates, plenary one speakers. Thank you. All right, I'm giving everybody an assignment. Stand up. Turn towards the door. Enjoy your coffee break. See you in 15 minutes.